Hello, everybody. My name is Moises Rendon, and I'm here to talk about humanist technology in oppressed societies, right? Um, um, I was born in democracy and raised in dictatorship. In the last 20 years, I've witnessed the collapse of a once rich nation and under an authoritarian regime. I live and work in Washington, D.C. in a think tank. I do research for public policies, especially on Venezuela, my native country. And that's why I'm here in Aragon. I'm very excited to talk and to learn about how these technology are able to help oppressive communities all over the world, right? And authoritarianism is booming. It's a booming business. There are more than 7 billion people on Earth. About 4 billion people are living under authoritarian regimes. Obviously, this is one of the most important challenges that humanity are facing in this century. And technology is playing a very important role. Today, I'm going to be talking about Venezuela. But again, these problems are applied all across, all over the world in different oppressive regimes. And we will see why in a minute. Okay. So Venezuela, again, was one of the most richest nations in Latin America. I used to absorb migrants and refugees from all over the world. At one point, it was known as the Switzerland of Latin America. Venezuela doesn't only have, it's not only rich in diversity and oil, it has the biggest oil reserve in the planet, one of the biggest gas reserves too. It has gold, it has minerals, but also has beautiful beaches, beautiful mountains, and more importantly, it has very important and human capital, right? But today, Venezuela is facing one of the worst humanitarian, economic, political, institutional crises that Latin America has ever seen in the history. And this is all 100% man-made. An earthquake, this was not caused by an earthquake or a hurricane or some sort of economic foreign warfare. This was all caused by corrupt institutions and corrupt systems with bad intentions, right? And you can see on the slide, former President Hugo Chavez, who passed away in 2013, and former President Nicolás Maduro, also former president, because I'm going to talk in a minute about what's going on right now. But again, this is a man-made crisis that right now has the country completely collapsed. And it's not only a dictatorship, right? It's not only, a corrupt system. This is also, it's been a 20-year institutional coup d'etat that Chavez started. So Venezuela today is kind of a blown kleptocrat mafia state. They're literally thieves in power. And this obviously makes the situation even worse, right? It's so complex to deal with narco trafficking and other nefarious activities within this institutional structure. It's hard for me. I don't think I'm able to even scratch the surface of this totally catastrophe and the dire situation that Venezuelans are facing today. Just on the slide, you can see the average Venezuelan has lost about 24 pounds in the last year. The health system is completely collapsed in a point where former eradicated diseases have emerged, and again, like malaria. And NGOs groups are reporting that 300,000 children are at risk of dying just because of malnutrition issues. There also have been reports of Venezuelans breaking into the zoo to eat animals, and there are also Venezuelans eating out of trash cans. This is one of the worst humanitarian refugee crises as well. There are 3 million people, so 3 million Venezuelans have fled the country in the last 2-3 years. And the numbers is only expected to increase. The UN is expected to have 5.3 million Venezuelans by the end of 2019. If that happens, if the status quo continues, the Venezuelan refugee crisis is going to be the worst in the world, even more than the Syrian refugee crisis. And when it comes to the economic front, the current economic collapse in Venezuela is 10 times worse than the financial crisis that we saw in 2008 and 2009. And again, this is the worst economic crisis right now in the world. Hyperinflation is expected to reach 10 million% this year. However, there are other indicators that are saying that the inflation is going to go up to 44 million. GDP, or the country's economy, was cut in half in the last 4 years. The GDP is down 45%. Poverty rose from 54% to 90% since 1999. And as you know, Venezuela depends on oil, and the oil production has also collapsed in this corrupt system. And again, I mean, obviously, there are many reasons why people want to flee Venezuela, right? The conditions inside of the country are just unlivable. And this is why you're seeing 50,000 Venezuelans crossing the border to Colombia every single day. Again, this is 50,000 people crossing the border every single day. Most of them are just crossing to get food and medicine, and they're going back to Venezuela, right? But about 5,000 to 7,000 are staying in Colombia permanently. These are not just statistics, right? These are human beings who deserve freedom and who deserve dignity. And this is what you have right now. You have, these numbers need to be updated, but today you have 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia, you have 750,000 in Ecuador and Peru, you have about 250,000 in Peru, in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina combined. You have about half of a million Venezuelans are between Europe and North America. So if you start adding all these numbers and add the people who fled the country even before, in the last 10, 20 years, you have about 4 million Venezuelans, right? And this represents almost 15% of the Venezuelan population, which is 30 million people. And now, I know most of you have heard about Venezuela in the last 2 weeks. There's a lot going on, and I just want to take a brief minute to explain what's happening. Maduro threw fraudulent elections in May of 2018, last year. And you know, Venezuelans are used to corrupt elections. But these elections were so obscene that even for the Venezuelan standard, right? And this is why more than 50 countries did not recognize the results and denounced elections as a fraud. When this situation happens, the Venezuelan constitution says that the presidency office should be taken temporary in a provisional basis by the President of the National Assembly. The main objective here is for him, the President of the National Assembly, to host free and fair elections and recover the civil liberties that were taken away from the previous process, right? And that's what we have today. Venezuela has a new president. His name is Juan Guaido. He was elected to the National Assembly. He's a 35-year-old young guy. And I just learned this morning that he has tweeted before about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So I'm encouraged to see what else he has in mind on this space. But the main point here is that, you know, we have a new president, and Maduro is no longer president. And that's why you see all these movements and the legal diplomatic implications of recognizing a new president in a country, right? And I can't really cover all the details of what's happening today, but I'm happy to chat with any of you if you want to learn more about what's happening today in Venezuela. Well, now that you have a context, I want to turn now into the repressive systems that Venezuelans are facing today. And maybe one of the most important is surveillance and control, right? Like every single state has some sort of surveillance and control system, including democratic countries like the US or the UK, but also private companies, right? We heard that yesterday. And you know, most of these surveillance systems vary depending on how much sophisticated they are, right? But when it comes to repressive nations, repressive states like China, like Russia, like North Korea, then you get the problem of that they do not respect basic human rights. And that's really the main difference that I want to highlight. This is the main tool that the Venezuelan regime has been using to control and surveil the Venezuelan people. It's called Carnet de la Patria. In English, it's the Fatherland Card. It's kind of a low-tech version of the Chinese social credit system. However, this Carnet de la Patria combines food rationing, gas, and voting. So it kind of goes a little bit further, right? One important point here is that these tools especially are targeted to the most vulnerable, marginalized Venezuelans, the poor people, right? So it's a very important point. Petro, the elephant in the room. I'm sure most of you have heard about Petro. Petro is nothing more than a campaign and a money-making scheme. This currency is not a real currency. It's not a real cryptocurrency. Is closer to a security, and the regime used it illegally to try to issue new debt. But you can't. It's not real. You can't really buy it. You can't sell it. You can't find it anywhere. So it doesn't really exist. It's just in the minds of the regime, basically. But the larger and more important point that I want to make here is that fiat money is highly regulated. It's highly controlled through exchange control systems, to banking controls, to banking surveillance, right? And these are common features in oppressed societies that you see, again, all across different oppressive regimes. Surveillance and social control, rigged voting, lack of civil liberties, lack of transparency, lack of property rights, lack of press and internet freedoms, populism and misinformation campaigns. And you know, the important point here is that all of these problems, all of these issues come down to centralized powers. And as all of you know, absolute power corrupt absolute, right? So it's something that we all need to keep in mind. Now I want to talk about how decentralized technology is helping today Venezuela. And I don't want to spend much time on this. I know most of you are familiar with cryptocurrency use cases, but I'm going to touch on two very important points. One is humanitarian relief, and the other one is voting. Aside from smuggling, cryptocurrency today is the only way to get humanitarian aid in Venezuela. And the reason is because the Maduro regime has continuously rejected humanitarian aid from abroad, despite the biggest humanitarian crisis that we see, right? There are groups on the ground in Venezuela receiving cryptocurrency donations and using those donations to buy food and distribute it among the most needed. There's another very interesting initiative that was born actually in Berlin, in EVE Berlin hackathon last year. The name of the project is Crypto for Christmas. And it basically uses NFT Christmas cards and donations to nonprofits, including Airdrop Venezuela and Bitcoin Venezuela, right? Via the GiveF app, by the way, which is amazing. It will be very interesting to see more tests like this, maybe using, implementing the Aragon voting app to, involve Venezuelans so they can maybe decide, participate, or where this donation should go, right? Because at the end of the day, the Venezuelans are the ones who are the most needed. Voting on political participation is also very important, and it's another way how this decentralized technology, freedom technology, can empower oppressed people in oppressed societies. And it's basically building censorship-resistant voting mechanisms for political participation is vital. Venezuela has very high percentage of voting participation compared to other average around the world. And despite that, the regime threatens and has imprisoned many political prisoners, many political leaders, and the Venezuelan people always try to use the voting as a mechanism, right? However, today they completely lost the trust of the local committee. There is no trust anymore. They don't vote anymore. And that's a huge, huge problem, right? And just in the last 8 days, there have been more than 850 political prisoners. They have put 700 of them in prison, and many of them are underage kids. To be precisely, 77 underage kids are in prison right now just because they were protesting last week in a massive protest in Caracas. Voting, I mean, today we have a huge task for President Guaido, right? Because he needs to host free and fair elections to lead the transition to democracy of the country. But there are no way that he can use the current electoral committee in Venezuela. As I mentioned, no one really trusts the voting committee right now in Venezuela. The current plan is to replace the board members of the electoral committee in the hoping that this will solve the issue. I think this is a naive assumption. I think that need is to replace the whole system with, manipulation-resistant voting mechanisms. So that's why today is a very important task for all of us to think about. There are other ways to help today. As I mentioned, that there is 13% of the Venezuelan population are outside of the territory. Most of these Venezuelans are highly educated. They are somehow technical savvy. However, none of them are involved, right, on the decision making on any way on what's happening in Venezuela. So there is a huge gap there where I think we can all think about on how to help. The other issue is identity. I mean, like in the blockchain space, Venezuelans are also struggling with identity issues. Most of Venezuelans have limited access to passports, to national IDs, and this leaving many Venezuelans trapped in Venezuela. And the ones who decide to flee the country without passports are very vulnerable, right? They can't work, they can't receive aid, they can't even prove who they are. So it's a very important issue that I think we should also keep in mind. So all the tools that we're talking about so far, need internet. And guess what? Venezuela is also struggling with the internet, mainly in two ways. One, the internet in Venezuela, the speed is one of the lowest one in the world. And you also there's a lot of electricity blackouts in Venezuela, so the access to internet is really, really limited. The other reason, the other issue is that the regime has used censorship, right? They're really good at blocking websites like Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia, news websites, especially on the days that are more important for the Venezuelan people, like when there is a protest and when there is a big news, big day happening, they go and block the website. So it's a big issue that I think we need to keep in mind too. Finally, I want to talk and look ahead to rebuilding and recovering from authoritarian regimes, right? And this is a question that really keeps me awake at night. And it's how to build institutions in a way that these problems don't come back, right? And when I think about this and, being in Washington, I don't think the tools from the 20th century are the tools that we need, especially when it comes to failed states like Venezuela. Tragically, the international war institutions and organizations have failed to properly address corrupt, oppressed systems. Organizations such as the UN, such as the World Bank, such as the IMF, they have a mandate to address poverty, health, peace, but they have failed when it comes to stand up against oppression. And we don't also have good examples of rebuilding institutions either, because most of the examples are highly centralized and not inclusive. And the examples, the list is long. We can go on over, but they're not good examples of rebuilding institutions based on the current organizations. So, and as I mentioned before, the Mafia state is very entrenched in the institutions and governance in Venezuela. So Venezuela will need not only to dismantle the institutions, and the government, but also will have to deal with narco trafficking and other nefarious activities. When it comes to Venezuela, Venezuela is going to really need to rebuild the whole institutional governance, government in all ways, in all sectors. But I think there are three key pillars here that I think are highly relevant for the humanist technology that we're all talking about in these last 2 days. One is transparency and corruption, right? The second one is justice and dispute resolution. And the third one is property rights. When it comes to transparency and corruption, Venezuela is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And in fact, their estimates are that $1 trillion have been stolen from the Venezuelan people. The regime has been used 2 main mechanisms to steal that money. One is the state-owned company PDVSA, and also through public contracts or procurement. So there are 3 main ways that I think it would be interesting to think about when it comes to rebuilding Venezuela during a day-after scenario. One is efficient and transparent fund management of the world's biggest oil reserve, right? So think about PDVSA, maybe making PDVSA DAO would be interesting. A second way, because Venezuela has so many presence of oil companies from all over the world, maybe making a network of decentralized organization for private oil companies would be also very interesting. The second way, and this is crucial, is transparency in government spending and procurement. As I mentioned, the regime used government contracts and money to steal money. I mean, they literally send contracts to their family, their friends, and boom, corruption happens, right? And they steal the money. So having able to be to track all the transactions and all the spending from the government is going to be crucial during the day after scenario. And lastly, but not least, access to public data. There's no public data at all in this country, and in many other countries, obviously. So when it comes to public data, I think it's key to keep track of all the transactions and the indicators that are occurring. The second pillar is justice, right? You can't really rebuild any nation without a strong, robust justice. And in Venezuela, you have now 95% of homicide cases are not resolved. In fact, justice is being used as a political tool. And in the last 20 years, you can literally walk in a courtroom and buy and purchase the ruling that you desire. That's how corrupt the justice system is in Venezuela. I want to emphasize that these problems are not at the top level. They come from local courts all the way to the top, to the Supreme Court. In fact, Maduro packed the Supreme Court with loyalists. So it's a very important challenge. And one of the big gaps for the day after scenario in Venezuela is to build effective dispute resolution mechanisms, right? And this is where the Aragon court can maybe help. This is a Supreme Court building in downtown Caracas. You can see people literally burning down the building. Property rights, that's the third pillar and the last one. Venezuela ranks as one of the worst countries to protect property rights. There has been more than 1,200 expropriations of big companies in the last decade. When it comes to, obviously this is an area where public blockchain can help by providing and securing ownership. In Venezuela, but also in other repressive environments, it's really hard to secure and maintain ownership. And I will encourage you to read economist Hernando Di Soto. He wrote this book, The Wealth of Capital, which basically explained that the bedrock for prosperity and progress is property rights. You need to protect property rights and encourage the ownership. And I think there is a huge gap, even including for a day after scenario in Venezuela, when it comes to property rights. And to sum up, and I want you to live with these three points. Helping rebuild failed state. This technology can help rebuild failed state, especially when it comes to bad institutions, bad money, bad governance, and no accountability, no trust. Basically, everything will need to be built from the scratch. So it's an opportunity. And the second point is that it will help restore civil liberties. And third but not least, opting into an organization and governance is crucial, right? Like for the first time in rebuilding nation states history, the rebuild of Venezuela will allow citizens to opt into organizations that can experiment with new types of organizations, right? And opt into emerging governance solutions. Just to leave you with this last message, I mean, freedom is a daily exercise. It's a daily choice. And it's at the heart of the Aragon Manifesto. So I will challenge all of us to not be neutral on the face of injustice. This is equally important when we think about rebuilding the organizations of the future. Thank you very much.